بل محمد وآل محمد صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم. تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون. لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون. إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون. وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون. إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم. إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين. واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم اثنين فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون. قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون. قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين. قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم. قالوا طائركم معكم أين ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون. وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون. وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون. أتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون. إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين. إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون. قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لربي وجعلني من المكرمين. وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين. إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون. يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون. ألم يروا كما أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون. وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون. وآية لهم الأرض الميتة وأحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون. وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون. سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون. وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون. والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم. والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم. لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون. وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذرية في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون. وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين. وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون. وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين. وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله وأطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين. ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين. ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون. فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون. ونفخ في السور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم أن لا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنى يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكس في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقنا لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وظللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناهم من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة
محمد وآل محمد صلوات يا زهرا يا زهرا يا زهرا يا زهرا اے میری بیبی اے میری بیبی تیرے در پہ استغاثہ ہے تیرا ممنون میری شہزادی جہاں سارا ہے یا زہرا یا زہرا تجھ کو امت نے یوں ستایا ہے، مرگ محسن پہ بھی رلایا ہے، تجھ کو بابا کے بعد امت نے ہائے دربار میں بلایا ہے، یا زہرا یا زہرا، اے میری بی بی، اے میری بی بی، دیکھ کر تیری مصیبت کو سارے عالم کا دل مصائب سے پرا پرا ہے، یا زہرا یا زہرا، تیرے دل پر ہے جو ستم ٹوٹے، زندگی میں جو تو نے غم دیکھے، آسمانوں زمیں پہ گر ہوتے، ملے شب وہ سیاہ ہو جاتے، یا زہرا یا زہرا، اے میری بی بی، اے میری بی بی، کتنے صد میں اٹھائے ہیں، جیتے جی تجھ کو میری شہزادی غم نے مارا ہے، یا زہرا خون بن کر رگوں میں ہے نوحہ، ہماری نسلوں میں بھی رہے نوحہ، جیسے میں نے پڑھا ہے بچپن سے، میرا نادے علی پرے نوحہ، یا زہرا یا، اے میری بی بی، اے میری بی بی، تیرے در پہ سر جھکاتے ہیں، ہر حسینی کا تیرے ٹوکوں پہ ہی گزارا ہے، یا زہرا فرش مجلس پہ اور مصلی پر، ہر جواں کہہ رہا ہے رو رو کر، ہم رہے نہ رہے مگر بی بی، تا قیامت رہے گا میں سرور، یا زہرا اے میری بی بی، اے میری بی بی، آنسوؤں نے دعا مانگی ہے، تیری تسبیح پڑھ کے دل نے تجھے پکارا ہے، یا زہرا تو ہمیں حفظ اور امان دے دے، اپنی چادر کا سائباں دے دے، تیری قدرت میں کیا نہیں بی بی، تو جسے چاہے دو جہاں دے دے، یا زہرا یا زہرا، قرض مقروض کا ادا کر دے، مفلسوں کا نصیب وا کر دے، جن کی گودی بھری نہیں بی بی، ان کو اولاد تو عطا کر دے یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، بر محمد وآل محمد صلوات۔
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sayyid Hasan Rizvi, respected elders, brothers, sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Surah Fat is requested for all the names listed on the screen in Kul Arwahil Mu'mineen wal Mu'minat Sabab al-Fatiha. Ayat Mayyajibun is requested for all the names listed on the screen and whoever is in need of it here and elsewhere. Let us all recite it together. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amman yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu as-su'. Amman yujibul mustarra idha da'ahu wa yakshifu as-su'. Amman yujibul مضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. اللهم صل على محمد وآل Muhammad. Now let us invite Sayyid to come forward and recite tonight's Majlis by Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad Salawat.
رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة بعد الصلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين. لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع نفوسنا والطبيب ذنوبنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين المنتجبين المكرمين الخيرين الفاضلين السيدين الصادقين لا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين روحي وأرواح العالمين لترى بمقدمه الفداء الذين أذهب الله عنهم رجسا وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين إلى قيام يوم الدين أما بعد صلوات على محمد وآل محمد اللهم صل على محمد. Mu'mineen, mu'minat, brothers and sisters in Islam and Iman, Salamun alaykum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight we begin a series of lectures and discussions commemorating the Shahadah of the beloved daughter of Rasulullah, the wife of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the mother of the purest children in all of existence, Imam Hasan, Imam Hussein, Bibi Zainab bin Kulthum, Fatemah Zahra, Sayyidat al-Nisa al-Alameen, Salawatullah alayha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. There's obviously a lot of questions about her as a figure in history. Now, there are some questions that are specifically related to her as an individual, her traits, her role, her responsibilities, her qualities. There are some which are specifically related to historical discussions, some very controversial, and some just pure historical details. There's also a lot of questions about her relationship with other ma'sumin. When we hear titles like she's Abiha, the mother of her father. This itself is talking about one of her traits, but in reference to her relationship to her father, to Rasulullah. So even within some of the titles that she has, Muhadditha, Tahira, all of these things, not only are they talking about just her and her names, but they also reflect personality traits that no other woman in existence possesses. There's also other types of questions that we have too, which normally try to compare and contrast Sayyidah Fatemah alayha salam with the other ma'sumin and other personalities. Now, it goes without saying that there's no way that we can really get through any of these questions even in one night. There's a lot of information that can be discussed about Sayyidah Fatemah. Even if we picked one question and dedicated a few nights, we still would not be able to get through all of that. And that's not by accident, it's actually on purpose. And why on purpose? It's done purposefully, that some parts and some ideas and concepts regarding the life and death of Sayyidah Fatemah alayha salam have been hidden, are shrouded in ambiguity. There's a deep reasoning for that. That itself requires its own discussion. Because there's so many different topics to go through, and even if we tried to discuss one of them tonight, we wouldn't be able to do so. Normally, as many of you have noticed, whenever we commemorate or celebrate a wilada or shahada of any of the holy personalities, we try our best to stick to one concept, one topic, and see what we can cover in about 20, 25, 30 minutes. I wanted to try something different tonight. Because normally when we end up going in depth, sometimes the point does get a little lost. We go too much in detail. Although some, they've come forward and they've said, we've benefited from that because there's in points that we haven't heard before. Some people say because it was so, high level, too philosophical, too in-depth, we just got lost. We didn't really understand anything. I said, okay, fine. What we'll try to do then is change gears, shift gears a little bit. There's a few questions that I'm sure many of you have on your minds that maybe have been answered, maybe haven't. Or maybe if they have been answered, it wasn't done in a satisfactory way. We want to try to go through a few of those different questions tonight. Some of them are going to be basic ones that hopefully we'll be able to answer in a few minutes. But there will be some other questions which are actually very deep. But what we're going to do is, instead of diving into, let's say, the philosophical explanation, instead of going through a more mystical, irfani look at these things, which we could do obviously, instead of that, what we're going to try to do is use some of the famous riwayat which have been narrated to answer these questions specifically. So we're not going to go and really offer too many analogies. We're not going to go look into philosophy and logic and irfan and things like that. We'll try to focus on the answers specifically given by sometimes the Ahlul Bayt themselves. Sometimes Allah Himself has given an answer in a Hadith al-Qudsi. We'll look at some of those. And one thing which is interesting is almost all of the answers that we'll be giving tonight have not only been, not only appeared in our books, in the books of the Shias, but a lot of these answers have also appeared in the books of the Ahlul Sunnah as well. So this is not a discussion, and some of these answers are not going to be restricted to us as followers of the Ahlul Bayt. Sometimes when we answer these questions, we end up just focusing on our own perspective. Most of the answers that we're going to do tonight, most of the questions and answers will be mixed from the books of the Ahlul Sunnah and our own Tashayyu books as well. So the first question that I'd like to start out with is starting with her name itself, the name Fatemah. Why was she given that name, and what significance does that name itself have? This answer will actually tell us a little bit about our relationship, the relationship that we should have with her, and the relationship that all Muslims need to have with her. If not, we'll see the consequences that they may face. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So first what we need to do is look into the root letters for the word, right? So Fatemah, the root letters are Fa, Ta, and Mim. Fatemah, right? When you use it, Fatemah as a verb, that usually is used in terms of Fatemah al-walad, or at-tifl. Usually you talk about a baby being weaned from a mother's milk. That's when that verb Fatemah is being used. So literally, the verb Fatemah means to wean somebody off of something. That thing normally was a nourishing factor for them. The item was normally beneficial for them. But after a while, it becomes an obstacle. After a while, that same thing is going to block that individual or that thing from growth. So that child or that individual is slowly taken off and pushed away from it. So we know, for example, babies, the best thing for them as they're growing up is their mother's milk. But after, the recommendation in Islam at least, is that they should try, a mother should try to nurse their child exclusively for 2 years, right? As much as they can. And even, there's some narrations say a little bit longer than 2 years, some say a little bit less. But generally the ulama agree that 2 years is a good number for a mother and a child to have, as far as relationship between, them and solely having that mother's milk. But then, between that 2 years, the mother will obviously try to wean them off. If you try to stop them at, 2 years exactly, it's going to be very, very difficult, right? And you don't want to have that pain of separation happen between the child and the mother. So we say wean because this is something that happens gradually. Now, when the explanations come in the narration, because many people, even Imam Ali alayhi salam asked, why is my wife, why is Fatemah named Fatemah? So he asks that. He asks Rasulullah specifically, and Rasulullah gives the answer. Sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So he begins describing his Bibi Fatemah and then gives the answer as well. So the first thing he talks about is Inna ibnati Fatemah hawra. Without a doubt, absolutely, my daughter Fatemah is a hur. She's an angel, an angelic being made of light, which has taken human form. Why? إِذْ لَمْ تَحِضْ وَلَمْ تَطْمَثْ. Why? Because no impurities, whether physical or spiritual, have ever touched her. Nothing which is impure has ever touched her at all. So this is the first thing that the Prophet mentions about her. Then he says, now let me tell you the reason, after this, why she's been named Fatemah. إِنَّمَا سُمِّيَتْ Fatemah. The only reason that she has been named Fatemah, لِأَنَّ اللَّهَ فَطَمَهَا وَمُحِبِّيَهَا عَنِ النَّارِ. Because it's not the Prophet naming her. He's saying Allah has named her Fatemah. Why? Because فَطَمَهَا, because He has weaned her عَنِ النَّارِ. He has completely kept her away from the fire of hell. And وَمُحِبِّيهَا, and anyone that's a true lover of Fatemah. So what Rasulullah here is talking about this. There's 3 points here in this narration. The first is he's mentioning the station and the value of his daughter Fatemah. That she is pure light put into human form. When you're done, and why is that? It's because, or what is the result of that? That no impurity, whether physical or spiritual has ever touched her. And sometimes you'll see this narration actually mentioned in Sunni books of tafsir when they talk about the Ayatul Tathir. That rijs, right? That impurity that we see, that it's been kept away from all the Ahlul Bayt. Some Sunni mufassirin, commentators of the Quran, they'll mention this specifically about, because they go through the Prophet, how he's been kept from impurity, and they mention narrations. Then they say, let's talk about Ali ibn Abi Talib, and they mention narrations about how he's been kept from impurities. Then they mention Fatemah, and they mention this type of narration. So there's been different versions of this, and this has been one of those in Sunni and Shia books. And the second part is saying that Allah is the one who has named Fatemah. Why? Because the fire, we have been weaned off of fire. Not just Fatemah herself, but the ones who are her muhibbeen, the ones who have that true love for her. Now, what does it mean to have that true love for her? Well, let's go now to the next narration, which is coming from our sixth Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. This narration starts off very similar to the way that Rasulullah's narration started off. So he says, Summiyat Fatemah fil ard Fatemah. So Fatemah has been named on earth Fatemah. So even there, he's talking about in the heavens, in the skies, in the higher dimensions, she's named Fatemah. But also in the physical realm, on earth, she's also named Fatemah. So this already, again, we can, like I said, all these narrations we could expand. Which means that sometimes when we talk about these personalities in the higher levels, next to Allah they have one name. But on earth they have a different name as well. He says, look, she's Fatemah in the higher realms, and on the earth she's also Fatemah. Why? لأن Allah. Again, because Allah, why? لأن Allah فطمها ومحبيها عن النار. Sorry, that was the first narration. So, sorry, this narration is لأنها فطمت شيعتها من النار. So it's very similar to the first one. He says, because her Shi'as, Fatima Shi'as, not the Shi'as of Ali, the Shi'as of Fatima, have been protected from fire. They've been weaned off and kept away from fire. Then the second part comes, which didn't come in the narration from Rasulullah. Then he says, وَفُطِمَتْ أَعْدَاءَهَا عَنِ الْحُبَّهَا. And the enemies of Fatima have been weaned off from her muhabbat and love. You see, muhabbat of Fatima is no different than the muhabbat of Rasulullah. We know that, right? Fatima is a part of me. Whoever loves her, loves me. Whoever is an enemy to her is an enemy of me as well. Over here, the sixth Imam is saying that on one hand, yes, those who have love for Fatima, they are kept away from fire. They're weaned from that fire. For normal individuals, fire not is actually a beneficial thing. It can actually purify their souls. But us, if we're truly lovers of Fatima, we don't need that. We have another form of purification. Just the love of Fatima, the true love of Fatima itself has purified our hearts, if we truly have that. We don't need the fire of hell to purify our hearts, like many others will need. On the other hand, what about the ones who actually have that hate, who are enemies of Fatima? Then, over here, the sixth Imam is saying, her enemies have been weaned off from her love. That same love which is acting as a protective shield to everybody else, that same love now is being kept away from everybody else, from her true enemies. So, let's look at this again. Hellfire normally is meant to purify people's souls. It's not this punishment that sometimes, you and I are taught. People sin, and they have to be cleansed. Right? When something is impure, right? Just like here, if you want to clean water, you boil it, right? You raise its temperature and then it cleans it of impurities. In the spiritual realm, it's the same thing. Hellfire is not just, some vicious God just punishing us. He's saying that, look, there are impurities within you that you have to be cleansed through the fire with. After that, you might be able to get to heaven now. It's possible. So normally, hellfire is a purifying agent for people. However, for those who have love of Fatima, that purifies their heart. But now, if you're an enemy of Fatima, that hellfire should have been a purifying agent for you. If you didn't have that, then that means the love of Fatima should have been a purifying agent for you. But if you are an enemy of Fatima, that means you don't get access to that purifying agent of her love, which means now the only thing left for you is hellfire. So automatically we understand, if somebody is an enemy of Fatima, they're going to end up in hellfire. So, sometimes we get attacked for our beliefs that, how can you say this about certain personalities? We're saying, look, if somebody is a clear enemy of Fatemah, if they have angered Fatemah during her lifetime, and in all of the books it's been narrated who her enemies are, who has angered her, then when you put two and two together, you'll see what the results are. These individuals will have to be tasting hellfire. There's no other option that we have here. Now, of course, Allah's the ultimate judge. But what we can understand, for ourselves at least, as a tip to take for ourselves, is that if we want to be kept away from hellfire, one of the best ways to do so is to make sure that we attach ourselves to Sayyidah Fatemah, Sayyidatun Nisa'il Alameen, Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. See, even in her name, there's a specific value being taught. That her name itself is expressing a value that she has in the heavens and in the earth. If we're able to connect to her, learn from her, understand what she did in history, make sure that we're not one of our enemies, because you and I can say that we love her, but if we act contrary to her sunnah, the way that she acted, then, in action we'll be actually just like her enemies. If we act in the same way that her enemies acted, going against the teachings of Rasulullah, going against the commandments of Rasulullah, then we'll be no different than the actual enemies which existed back then. So we need to make sure that we take a look and check our own actions every night if we can, and make sure, are they actions which are similar to the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt, the enemies of Fatemah, or are they closer to those who are the true lovers and supporters of Bibi Fatemah? So that's our first question. The second question that sometimes people ask, a lot of people, we get into this habit of comparing, right? Comparing the Ma'sumeen. And we say, okay, who was better, Rasulullah or Imam Ali? Which of the Imams were better? Well, we know that, Imam Hussein alayhi salam, he's Safinatul Najat, right? But all the other Imams, right, some of them have gone through even, some say, worse pain than Imam Hussein. Like, we have certain narrations which say that the time of the seventh Imam, Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, was a very difficult time for the Shias. Imam Musa al-Kadhim himself was tortured and oppressed, kept away from the Shia. And the Shias themselves, the Sadat themselves, they were being oppressed. They were being tortured and killed in huge numbers, which wasn't really happening during the time of Imam Hussein and other Imams. But sometimes we play this sort of, which Imam is worse, which Imam is better, which one should we attach with, whose life should we learn? And we kind of play this game. And I can understand why we'd want to do that, right? Because we have this idea that we should be comparing and contrasting. Luckily for us, we don't need to come and make up our own ideas, our own sort of rubric, our own criteria of what is good, what is better, what is bad, what is worse, what is oppression, what is not oppression, who has more qualities or not. These sort of ideas, the relationship between all of the Ma'sumeen, all of them have been explained already in the Ahadith. We don't need to make this up as we go along. We don't need to start playing guessing games. We can look in the narrations, and sometimes, the A'imma alayhimus salam have answered it and talked about, their own grandparents. They said, my grandfather, so-and-so Imam or Rasulullah was like this. My grandfather Ali, his station was like this. My grandmother Fatemah was like this. In other narrations, we see directly Imam Ali or Rasulullah talking about themselves and their descendants. And then sometimes, we see Allah Himself talking about what station has He given all the Ma'sumeen. So I want to give just some examples of all of these. And what was the actual station in terms of all of existence regarding this. And I'm sure many of you have heard the different versions of these narrations, but I want to give you just 3 of them tonight so that you can keep them in your mind. The in-depth explanations we're not going to go through, but I want you just to hear them here so that we don't get into this habit of comparing and contrasting and all this, but we know who are the major ones that we want to discuss and what is their position in the heavens. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So the first one is from Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. He's narrating and he says that خلقني الله تبارك وتعالى وأهل بيتي من نور واحد. Allah has created, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala has created me, يعني Rasulullah, and my Ahl Bayt min nurin wahid. From one nur, from one light. Many of us have heard this narration talked about, right? We at least heard the concept that all of the Ahlul Bayt are one light, so they're all the same thing. But I want to have you hear the different versions that have been narrated. And again, this is not just in our books. This is in books of Ahlul Sunnah as well. So, Prophet says, myself, my Ahlul Bayt, we are one nur, one light, one being, one existence. But then he adds on to this even some, more sort of amazing, sort of astonishing points. That we've been created from this one light and one nur. قبل أن يخلق آدم بسبعة آلاف عام. This nur wahid, we have been created. The Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, one light, all of this was created 7,000 years before the creation of Nabi Adam alayhi salam. Now, don't take this literally of 7,000 years. All right, we're talking about higher levels of being. So this is not literal. For those who just want numbers, then at least you know that this is, really, really far in advance. But for those who know that these numbers are a secret, and I said we're not going to go into those tonight, but I want you to at least hear them out loud. This is talking about something completely different. 7,000 years before the creation of Adam, the light of the Ahlul Bayt has been created. Well, now we might say, okay, well, what's the relationship then? You created their nur, what does this have to do with Nabi Adam then? So, then we continue the narration. ثُمَّ نَقَلَنَا إِلَى صُلْبِ آدَمَ. Then Allah transferred our nur into the sulb of Adam, into the core and the essence of Nabi Adam. You see, sometimes there's other narrations which I think we're going to get to a little bit later. And all these narrations, when you take them in conjunction, they all will make much more sense. Sometimes we hear these narrations piecemeal, we hear one over here and we're like, what the heck does that mean? It doesn't make any sense. This sounds like it's kufr or it's ghulu, it's extreme, this can't be anything. And then sometimes we get attacked by, not just internally, but of course other Wahhabis, Salafis, and sometimes just generally Ahlul Sunnah, that you guys have this weird ideas about your Ahlul Bayt. So look at all the narrations together about their creation, about their role and their relationship and their responsibilities. But remember that we have these in our books, of course, but a lot of these ideas are coming from your books as well. Now, it's up for you to decide what you want to do with the narration. We're not going to tell you how to authenticate your own narrations. That's for you, Ahlul Sunnah. You can go and say it's inauthentic, that's up to you, right? We're not going to get involved. But at the very least, we're not just saying that this is something restricted to our school of thought as well. Many Sunni Sufis have the same idea. And many lovers of the Ahlul Bayt from the Sunni school of thought have these same sort of ideas. Now their tafsir and their explanation may be a little different, but the point is that the main core idea is the same. And this is something that can actually bring us together. Whereas, unfortunately, there are certain personalities who are, now becoming more and more well-known, who are engaging in these multi-million-dollar projects, and they have a specific intention in mind to break up the relationship between Sunnis and Shias. They have a specific agenda in mind. And I think most of you probably know what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about. And there's many who are doing this sort of work. They don't care that the ulama from the beginning, from the time of the A'immah alayhimus salam, up until now have been working tirelessly to say, look, we have our differences. We can discuss our historical differences. There's nothing wrong with having an academic discussion, fine. But why would anybody from either side want to go and insult, to have this inflammatory language, to push people emotionally? What's the point of that? What does that solve? We wouldn't want to do it in a normal conversation. Why would we want to do this in a religious theological conversation? If we have one book, we have one kitab, we have the same Allah, we have the same Prophet, everybody has the same idea. Sunnis and Shias about Sayyidah Fatemah. They can't deny that she is the greatest woman that has been created. Nobody can deny that. They can't deny Rasulullah's love for her. They can't deny her anger at the end. These points can't be denied in history. So all of these things are there and they can be discussed properly. But if somebody is going to be, inflammatory, if they're going to create certain things just to divide people, we have to ask, what are you doing this for? Who is telling you that this is a good idea? Are you getting this from the Quran, that you're supposed to divide people up? Are we getting this from the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, that we're supposed to come and split people up? When we have from the 6th Imam, that we should be going and praying together when possible, that we should visit each other sick, that we should go to each other's janazas. This is the narrations that are there. But instead, again, we have people who, for whatever reason, get this sort of high. They enjoy that feeling of pushing people away. They enjoy causing fitna in the Muslim ummah. And they start to break up the relationship that has taken so long to develop between Sunnis and Shias. Again, this is something that's happened between ulama for hundreds and hundreds of years. Over 1,000 years this has been happening. But now all of a sudden, many people have been trying. They have a lot of money, and we'll say sometimes even governments behind them who are pushing for these things. You and I need to be very, very careful and make sure we don't fall into these dangerous traps. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Let's continue now the narration. So, Adam is now being used. Nabi Adam alayhi salam is being used as almost just, like I don't know how to put it, right? He is now the repository. He's holding the core essence of the purest light in existence, which is the Nur of Ali Muhammad. That's what he has within him. So what happens after that? ثُمَّ نَقَلَنَا مِن صُلْبِهِ فِي أَصْلَابِ الطَّاهِرِينَ. Then that same Nur, that same existence, that same wujud and being, that pure light of the Prophet, the Ahlul Bayt, gets passed down from the core of Nabi Adam to the cores and essences of all the Tahirin, all the other pure individuals that come from his line. And then they continue. From there, إِلَى أَرْحَامِ الطَّاهِرِينَ. So there's sulb, meaning the male cores and essences, and then the arham, or what we sometimes say would be wombs, right? So you have the male core and essence and the female core and essences. So from the lineage of Nabi Adam and Bibi Hawa alayhim as-salam, through them that Nur of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad has been passed down from generation to generation till it finally manifested in physical form in Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in Imam Ali alayhi salatu wasalam, in Bibi Fatemah alayhi salatu wasalam, in Imam Hasan and Imam Hussein, and all the other ma'asumeen salawatullah alayhim ajma'een. This is just one example of one narration. Now, this was a narration from Rasulullah. Now let me get you one step higher. This is a hadith al-Qudsi that the Prophet is narrating right from Allah. So Allah now is speaking to the Prophet. So it's the same sort of style, right? About Nur Wahid, but the language is slightly different. So Allah says to the Holy Prophet, Ya Muhammad, Inni khalaqtu Aliyya wa Fatemah wal Hasan wal Hussein alayhim as-salam wal a'imma min nurin wahid. Ya Muhammad, without a doubt, absolutely, I have created Ali, Fatemah, Hasan and Hussein, and all of the a'imma min nur wahid. Same point, from one light, from one nur, one being, one existence. Then there's another point that's added here that wasn't in the previous narration. ثُمَّ أَرَضْتُ وَلَايَاتُهُمْ عَلَى الْمَلَائِكَةِ. Then I dispersed, I gave out, and I sent out their walaya, I entrusted it to the malaika. I entrusted it to those high-level beings, those angels. فَمَنْ قَبِلَهَا كَانَ مِنَ الْمُقَرِّبِينَ. Whichever of those angels accepted it, they became the closest angels, the muqarrabin, right? Because we know we have different levels of angels. وَمَنْ جَحَدَهَا كَانَ مِنَ الْكَافِرِينَ. And whichever of the angels rejected it, understood that Nur Wahid, but they rejected it openly, they became the kafirin. Of course, this opens up a lot of other questions. What does it mean to be a kafir angel? It sounds a little strange. Again, we're talking about a different realm of angels. I don't want to get into that because that requires a different discussion, right? The point here is, again, the same thing. All of the Ahlul Bayt are created from that same nur, that same light. That wilaya also has been sent down on the angels. And even the angels, some of them were able to accept it and some of them were not. And of course in other narrations, which because of lack of time I'm not going to open up. I'm just going to end with one last one before we end tonight, which talks about how this same thing relates to us as followers of the Ahlul Bayt. So this one is coming from Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, and he says, قال سمعت رسول الله, I heard from Rasulullah, يقول إن الله عز وجل خلقني وخلق عليا وفاطمة والحسن والحسين من نور واحد. So same point in the beginning, I heard Rasulullah say, Jabir says, I heard Rasulullah say that he created Ali and Fatima and Hassan and Hussein from one light, from one nur. Then, فَعَصَرَ ذَلِكَ النُّورِ عَصَرَتْ. Then Allah took that nur, that light, that being, and He performed an asir. He squeezed it. He put pressure on it. He filtered it. And then, فَخَرَجَ مِنْهُ شِيَعْتُنَا. From that squeezed and filtered nur, that's where our Shias came from. From that light, that pure nur, this is where the Shia of Ahlul Bayt came from. You see, being a follower of Ali Muhammad, people say, oh, you know, this seems like this game of blood lineage, this and that. No. This is a game of, again, I don't want to go into this deeper thing, I'll let you reflect on that. This is about those who have truly accepted their wilayah. That nur, that wilayah, has been given to many individuals. It's even been given to angels. That light has been passed down from generation to generation for those who can handle it, but it's up for us in our daily lives to figure out whether we will accept that or not. It's up for grabs. You and I can decide that, you know, I see that nur, it's been passed down from our parents, I can accept it or I can reject it. If I accept it like some of the angels did, I can be those who are purified from that nur of Fatemah. If I reject it, then I'll be unfortunate, I'll have to be kept away from the love of Fatemah, and then I'll have to experience a purification process, which will be through hellfire. Then, he ends the narration says, after this, فَسَبَّحْنَا فَسَبَّحُوا. Then we, the Ahlul Bayt, we did tasbih of Allah, and then the Shi'as, they did tasbih as well. And وَقَدَّسْنَا, we did taqdees. We declared Allah to be Ya Quddus. We Ahlul Bayt did that, and then فَقَدَّسُوا. Then the Shi'as did that as well. So from that same light, from that same nur, the Shias of Ali Muhammad followed in the footsteps of the Ahlul Bayt. When we want to follow in the footsteps of the Ahlul Bayt, we have to make sure that every single thing that we do in our lives is following in that same footsteps, right? We have to get out of this mindset that, you know, the Ma'asumin, Ali Muhammad, they have their own level, they have their own, you know, wazifa and their own responsibilities. You know, they're the Ma'asumin, we can't get to their level. The Ma'asumin, alayhimus salam, are telling us themselves, if you have love for us, specifically for Fatemah, then you will be cut from the same, you know, wood as us, the same material, the same piece of being, that same nur, you'll be from us as well. If you are that, then the tasbih that you do, you'll follow the same tasbih that we do. If you want to glorify Allah the way that we do, then you'll be just like us. So as we start to figure out and ask these questions, you know, what do we do, how do we do it? Look at the narrations of the Ahlul Bayt. Don't bring in our own understandings. Put your own aql and opinions aside and see, what have the Ahlul Bayt taught me? What have they laid down? And all I have to say is sami'na wa ata'na. I hear, I obey, and the love of Fatemah is something that can be that separating factor between who is a true lover of the Ahlul Bayt and who is someone who is just a pretender. May Allah make sure that we are one of those who are true lovers of Fatemah and not those who are pretenders. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So I'm already over time, and again, there's a lot of other questions that I want to go through about, you know, her position and rank, you know, whether she was an imam or not, how she was as a hujjah. Her, you know, there's other narrations which talk about her being the reason for why Rasulullah and Imam Ali were created. Again, there's a lot of stuff written about Bibi Fatemah. But we have to end on that note, and inshallah maybe on another night. And if anybody has any questions, of course, Slido's always open. We can ask these questions and try to respond as much as possible on other nights. But of course, we want to pay our respects to our beloved Sayyidah. She's the daughter of Rasulullah. And just like Rasulullah throughout his life had gone through many trials and tribulations, Bibi Fatemah also had to witness trial after trial after trial. The first difficulty that she faces is when she's alongside her father throughout his life, throughout his mission. As she sees he's trying to bring people to that same Nur Wahid, to make them Shi'as, to make them followers of Islam, to make them obey Allah. And you see people reject Rasulullah. They throw trash on Rasulullah. They throw stones and rocks at Rasulullah. They abuse him. Who is the one who nurses him back to health? Who is the one who removes that trash and garbage from him? It's the one who no impurity has ever touched. Bibi Fatemah is the mother of her father. Anytime Rasulullah would come back, she would be taking care of him. But of course, like any daughter, like any mother, whenever she saw her own father going through this, that pain was with her as well. When she sees afterwards, when people on one day, they accept the wilayah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and then just in a second breath, only a little while later, they completely throw that wilayah back in his face. She now is the one walking, running, door to door, knocking on the doors of the Ansar, of the Muhajirin, saying, weren't you there at Ghadir? Didn't you give your bay'ah to my husband, to our Imam, to our Amir? Why are you going against your word? Why aren't you defending his right and his haqq? She sees and has to deal with the tragedy of the loss of Rasulullah. And they say that that pain tore at her for many, many years. There's many ways that we can describe the gham and the difficulties that Fatemah had to go through. But I'd like for us to focus on just one part of her gham tonight. And it's not just her gham and her musibah, but it's the musibah of the family. Because they're nur wahid. So it's not just their light in being and their ilm that is one, but it's also their musibah which is one as well. They share in that pain and suffering as well. Think about tonight, not what happened before she had passed away. Don't think what happened at the time of her death, but think about what is going on in the house of Fatemah, in the house of Rasulullah, in the house of the Ahlul Bayt. As they're going and they're looking at the body, the janazah, the mayt of Fatemah. And who's there? A husband is there. 2 young children are there. 4 young children are there. 2 young sons and 2 young daughters. Can you imagine these 4 young children looking at the dead body of their mother? Many of us, our mothers, may Allah grant, if they're alive, grant them a longer life. For those of our mothers who have passed on, may Allah bless their souls. We all want our parents to live with us a long time. Think about this. Imam Hasan, 8 years old. Imam Hussein, 7 years old. Zainab, 6 years old. Kulthum, they say only 2 years old. And they're there with their father, Imam Ali, who's heartbroken, who's probably barely able to compose himself and can't maintain his patience, trying to wash the body of his beloved wife. His heart, his backbone in his struggles throughout his life. These young children are having to watch their father go through all these trials and tribulations. Can you imagine all of them as one family trying to perform the ghusl in that house? Can you imagine Imam Ali telling Hasan, go bring some water, go with Hussein, pour some water on this part so I can wash the body of Fatemah? Can you imagine Zainab and Kulthum coming and saying, you haven't seen a janazah before, let me show you how to wash a female's body, let me show you what to do. Can you imagine children so young having to watch their mother in this sort of state, that they're bathing one by one? Can you imagine now that on top of this, Imam Ali has to tell them that as we're doing all of this, remember the wasiyah of your mother that we're not allowed to cry, we can't share our emotions, we can't express our grief loudly. Can you imagine the ghurba? This is the real ghurba. Sometimes we say Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida, he's gharib al-ghuraba because he's kept away from his family. We say Imam Hussein is gharib al-ghuraba because he's kept away and he's buried away from his family. But the ghurba began right there in Medina. Can you imagine being in your own hometown and being told that you're not allowed to cry? Why is it that they can't cry? Because the people around, the people of Medina themselves have become an enemy of Islam. Enemies of Islam and enemies of the Ahlul Bayt. They say, you Hasan, you Hussein, Kulthum, Zainab, you're not allowed to cry for your mother, because if you cry for them, then people will come. And your mother's wasiyah is that we have to control our cries over here. But as we know later on, people were not able to control their cries. One in particular, we see that when Imam Ali is passing through and finishing up the ghusl, when he begins to scream loudly, and they say, some narrations say he bangs his head against the wall. Imam Hasan and Hussein say, Ya Abata, you told us that we are not allowed to cry loudly, but now you're the one who's crying loudly now. Why are you going against your order? They say, if only you could see what I see, if only you could have felt what I felt. Ya Fatemah, Ya bint Rasulullah, what have you hidden from me? ألا لعنة الله على قوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون رضا بقضائه وتسلیما لأمره صلوات علی محمد وعلی محمد.
سینے میں لیے رنج و علم کرب و بلا کا، بابا سے ہے ملنے کو چلی ام ابیہا، آنکھوں سے لہو بہتا ہے، پہلو ہے شکستہ، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ، یا فاطمہ زہرا. امت نے بہت آپ کو تر پایا ہے بی بی، ہر حق کے لیے آپ کو ترسایا ہے بی بی. غاصب نے جو دربار میں بلوایا ہے بی بی، اس دکھ سے لرزنے لگا خود عرش خدا کا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا. سینے میں ازل سے ہی میرے کرب و بلا ہے، جاتے ہوئے زہرا نے یہ دنیا سے کہا ہے، کیا شام میں ہونا ہے یہ سب مجھ کو پتا ہے، کٹتے ہوئے صحرا میں ہے شبیر کا لاشا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، فاطمہ زہرا. یہ کام رہا صدیوں سے بس اہل عزا کا، پیاسوں کے لیے بہتا رہا اشکوں کا دریا، شبیر کا پرسا دیا زہرا کو ہمیشہ، شبیر کو دو مادرے شبیر کا پرسا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا زہرا، یا فاطمہ زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا اے میرے بی بی، اے میری بی بی، تیرے در پہ استغاثہ ہے، تیرا ممنون میری شہزادی یہ جہاں سارا ہے، یا زہرا، یا زہرا، یا زہرا یا تو ہمیں حفظ اور امان دے دے، اپنی چادر کا سائباں دے دے، تیری قدرت میں کیا نہیں بی بی، تو جسے چاہے دو جہاں دے دے، یا زہرا یا زہرا یا تیرا دربار وہ سخی در ہے، ہر فرشتہ جہاں گداگر ہے، تیرے مکروز آسماں والے، تیرا مکروز ہر سکندر ہے، یا زہرا یا زہرا یا زہرا یا فرش مجلس پہ اور مصلی پر ہر جوان کہہ رہا ہے رو رو کر، ہم رہے نہ رہے مگر بی بی، تا قیامت رہے غم سرور، یا زہرا یا زہرا یا مجلس غم میں اشک برسانے آ سکے یا نہیں خدا جانے، کیا بھروسہ ہماری سانسوں کا، اب کہاں ہم کہاں عزا کھانے، یا زہرا یا زہرا یا تجھ کو امت نے یوں ستایا ہے، مرگ محسن پہ بھی رلایا ہے، تجھ کو بابا کے بعد امت نے ہائے دربار میں بلایا ہے، یا زہرا یا زہرا یا زہرا یا زہرا۔ الفاتحہ۔
اللہم صلی اللہ محمد وعلی محمد۔ بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم۔ اللہم کل ولیک الحجت ابن الحسن صلواتک علیہ وعلی آبائہ فی هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا وذليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرزك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين۔ السلام علیکم یا ابا عبداللہ، السلام علیکم یا ابن رسول اللہ، السلام علیکم یا امیر المؤمنین وسید وسین، السلام علیکم یا فاطمۃ الزہرا سید نساء العالمین، السلام علی الحسین وعلی علی بن الحسین وعلی اولاد الحسین وعلی اصحاب الحسین جمعین ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ۔ السلام علیکم یا مولا ابن مولا، السلام علیکم یا غریب و غربا او سلطان الحسن مولانا علی نموس رضا، کن شفیعنا و شفیع والدینا فی یوم الجزاء ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ۔ السلام علیکم یا اصحاب العذر والزمان سیدی علمان علمان علمان، السلام علیکم یا خلیفۃ الرحمن، السلام علیکم یا شریک القرآن، السلام علیکم یا کعبۃ ایمان، السلام علیکم یا امام الانس والجان، اجر اللہ فرجک واستغفر اللہ مخرجک وظہورک ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ۔